When the Whitaker family moved into the grand, Spanish-style estate in Santa Barbara, they thought they had found paradise. The sprawling home, perched on a hill overlooking the Pacific Ocean, had once belonged to the legendary actor Ron Ely, best known for playing Tarzan in the 1960s. To them, it was a piece of Hollywood history. To the locals, it was something else entirely. "You bought that house?" the barista at the local coffee shop asked when Daniel Whitaker casually mentioned their new address. "You know what happened there, right?" The truth was, Daniel and his wife, Lauren, had heard whispers of tragedy. Ely's later years had been marked by loss, including a horrific night in 2019 when his wife was killed, and their son was shot by police. The house had been abandoned since, sitting in eerie silence, a monument to a family's pain. But the Whitakers weren't superstitious. "It's just a house," Lauren said. "It can't hold onto the past forever." They were wrong. From the first night, something felt off. Their daughter, Emily, a quiet but curious 10-year-old, was the first to notice. "Who's the man in the backyard?" she asked over breakfast. Daniel frowned. "What man?" "The one who stands near the pool at night," Emily said. "He's really tall." Daniel checked the security cameras. Nothing, just the dark outline of the palm trees swaying in the breeze. Then came the footsteps, soft at first like someone pacing in an upstairs room. But the sound grew louder each night, echoing down the hallways. Daniel would get up, expecting to find Emily out of bed, only to discover her fast asleep. One night, Lauren woke up gasping. "I heard it," she whispered. "A voice." "What did it say?" She hesitated. Then, barely above a whisper, "Get out." Desperate for answers, Lauren started digging into the house's history. Beyond the well-documented tragedy of 2019, there were older stories of Ely himself speaking about strange occurrences in the house. Lights turning on by themselves, doors locking without explanation, a heavy presence watching. Some claimed Ely had grown obsessed with the supernatural in his later years, convinced that something lurked in the home long before his family's tragedy. A lingering spirit, perhaps from the land itself. Others believed it wasn't just any spirit. Some said Ely, in his grief, had never truly left. One night, Daniel saw him. It was just past midnight when he walked past the living room and noticed the faint glow of the television. It had turned on by itself. The screen flickered, playing an old episode of Tarzan. And there, in the reflection of the glass, stood a tall, shadowy figure. Watching, Daniel turned, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The next day, they put the house back on the market. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. Some stories don't want to be forgotten. And some legends never fade. They haunt the world they left behind, waiting for the next soul who dares to enter. The Whitakers did not leave immediately. Houses, after all, did not sell overnight, and despite their growing unease, they could not justify abandoning the property without an explanation that made sense outside of whispers and shadows. So they stayed, though their nights grew heavier, the air in the house thick with something unseen yet undeniable. Lauren found herself waking at odd hours, the sheets damp with sweat, her skin prickling as if something in the room had shifted in her sleep. The silence of the house was oppressive in those hours before dawn, pressing in on her ears, muting the distant hum of the ocean. She would listen, lying stiffly on her side, waiting for the sound, the footsteps, the voice, the presence. But it never came when she was ready for it. The television continued its strange, inexplicable habit of switching on by itself. Always the same show, always some forgotten episode of Tarzan. The grainy image flickering in the darkness like a ghost trapped in static. More than once, Lauren found Daniel standing in front of it, staring, the blue light casting deep hollows in his face. "I must have sat on the remote," he murmured the first time, though the remote lay untouched on the coffee table. The second time, he had no excuse. The third time, he didn't even try to explain. And then there was Emily. At first, it was little things, words she mumbled in her sleep, names she should not have known. She spoke of the tall man more frequently now, her voice casual, as though discussing a neighbor they had simply never met. "He likes to walk at night," she told Lauren one morning over cereal, spoon clinking against porcelain. He doesn't always stay in the backyard. Lauren's breath caught. Where else does he go? Emily chewed slowly, eyes distant, as if she were listening to something her mother could not hear. Sometimes he comes inside. Lauren gripped the edge of the table, her fingers pressing into the wood. Emily, she said carefully, have you seen him inside? The girl hesitated, her spoon pausing midair, dripping milk onto the table. Not with my eyes, she said finally. But he's here. Lauren's stomach turned to ice. The house itself seemed to breathe with them now, its walls shifting and settling in ways that felt unnatural. The wood creaked underfoot even when no one moved. The air carried a scent that did not belong to them, faint and fleeting, like the worn leather of an old chair, the musk of forgotten books, the distant hint of something metallic. And then there was the study. They had not touched the room since moving in. The door had been closed when they arrived, the key resting in the lock as if waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to turn it. It was an unremarkable space, windowless, filled with bookshelves that sagged under the weight of old scripts and memorabilia. A heavy desk sat in the center, its polished surface marred by deep scratches, as if something had once been dragged across it with force. But it was the chair that disturbed Lauren the most. It was large, an antique of deep mahogany, the kind of chair that invited a man to lean back and survey his domain. And yet, every time she entered the study, it felt as though someone had just risen from it, as if the seat still carried the lingering warmth of a body that was no longer there. One night, as she passed by the half-open door, she saw it move. The chair did not glide or slide, but instead twisted just slightly, just enough, as if turning toward her. She gasped, stumbling back, her breath caught in her throat. The air in the room felt suddenly heavier, pressing against her skin, making her ears ring with the force of its silence. And then, from somewhere inside the study, deep and low, came a sound. A breath, long, slow, drawn in through unseen lungs, exhaled in the space between worlds. Lauren did not scream. She did not move. She only listened, her pulse thundering in her ears, his breath filling the silence like a whisper of something ancient and waiting. Behind her, Emily's small voice broke the stillness. He wants you to know he's here. The house had stopped pretending to be empty. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The study door remained closed after that night. Lauren had not touched it, had not even looked at it directly since the knowing presence in the dark. But the house would not let her forget. It lingered in the way the air felt different near that room, thicker, weighted. The hallway leading to the study had a stillness to it, a kind of unnatural quiet, as if sound itself was swallowed there. The shadows along the floor stretched farther than they should, bending at odd angles under the dim glow of the sconces. Emily no longer spoke of him aloud, but Lauren would catch her staring. Sometimes at the long hallway, sometimes at the staircase, sometimes at nothing at all. Her gaze would follow invisible shapes, her head tilting ever so slightly, as if she were listening. And then, one evening, she began to hum. It was a slow, drawn-out tune, one Lauren did not recognize. The notes were soft, almost mournful, rising and falling in a rhythm that felt strangely deliberate. "Where did you learn that?" Lauren asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Emily sat cross-legged on the living room floor, her fingers idly tracing patterns on the old rug. She did not look up. "I didn't learn it," she murmured. Lauren felt her skin prickle. "Then how do you know it?" Emily's small shoulders lifted in a shrug. "He hums it sometimes. When he's walking." Lauren's breath caught. The wind outside howled against the windows, rattling the glass in its frame. But inside, the house was silent, too silent. And then, from somewhere upstairs, she heard it. The same tune, hummed softly, barely above the edge of perception, carrying through the walls like a breath that did not belong. She turned sharply toward Daniel, expecting him to have heard it too, expecting his eyes to widen in the same dawning horror she felt curling inside her chest. But Daniel did not look alarmed. He did not look up from his laptop, the blue light flickering against his face. He had not heard it. Only she had. Lauren did not sleep that night. She lay beside Daniel, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house shift around her. The wind outside had died down, and yet the branches outside their window still tapped softly against the glass. The heater had shut off hours ago, and yet the air in the room felt warmer, heavier. At some point she did not know when she became aware of a sound. It was not the humming this time. It was footsteps, slow, measured, not coming from the hallway, but from inside the bedroom. She held her breath, her fingers gripping the sheets so tightly her knuckles ached. She did not dare turn her head. The steps moved toward the bed. A soft creak of the floorboard. A shift in the air. Presence tangible, looming. And then silence. It was there, standing over her. She squeezed her eyes shut, every instinct screaming at her not to move, not to acknowledge it. The air smelled of something distant, something old dust, leather, and something metallic beneath it. Minutes stretched into an eternity. And then, just when she thought she could bear it no longer, a hand, not touching her, not quite, but hovering just above her shoulder. She felt it, the weight of it, the pressure in the air, the cold static prickling against her skin. And then, in the darkness, a whisper, so close it brushed against her ear. "You shouldn't be here." Lauren woke with a gasp, her body jerking upright, heart slamming against her ribs. The room was empty. Daniel slept beside her, undisturbed, his breathing slow and even. The air was still. The house was quiet. But she knew that it had not been a dream. She turned to Daniel, shaking his shoulder, her voice urgent. "We have to leave." He groaned, eyes barely opening. "What?" "Lauren, it's the middle of the night. We can't stay here." Her voice was shaking. "Something is in this house, Daniel. It's real. I felt it." Daniel sighed, rubbing his eyes. "Lauren, please. We've talked about this." He sat up, his expression groggy, exasperated. "We can't just..." And then he stopped. Lauren watched the color drain from his face, his lips parting slightly as he stared past her. She did not want to turn. She did not want to see what was behind her. But she did. And there, in the dim glow of the moonlight filtering through the window, the study door was open, wide open, though neither of them had touched it. And from the darkness beyond it, something moved. A shadow, tall and watching, waiting. The house was waking up. The study door yawned open, a black wound in the dim hallway. Lauren's breath caught in her throat. The house had been still, the night quiet, but now the silence pressed against her ears with a density that made her head swim. She could hear Daniel's breathing beside her, shallow, uneasy. He had seen it too. Neither of them moved. The door had been closed. They had closed it. Yet now it stood ajar, and something shifted beyond its threshold. Not a figure, not something so solid, but a movement, a distortion in the air, as if the darkness within the room had weight, shape, intent. Daniel was the first to speak, though his voice was hoarse, uncertain. "It's just the wind," he muttered. "We didn't latch it." Lauren turned to him, barely able to contain the tremor in her whisper. "The windows are shut." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line, but he swung his legs off the bed nonetheless, pushing himself upright with forced determination. "I'll check it." "Daniel, no." She reached for his wrist, her fingers tightening around him. "Something is." A sound stopped her. From inside the study, a slow, deliberate scrape, like wood dragging against wood. Daniel froze. His body went rigid beneath her grip, his head tilting slightly, listening. The scrape came again, unmistakable now, a chair shifting. The chair. Lauren knew, even before she could process the thought fully, what had moved. The heavy mahogany desk chair, the one that always felt as if it had just been vacated. It was moving. And then, worse than the sound, worse than the open door, worse than the lingering weight of the thing unseen, came the breath. Soft, measured, close, a presence exhaling into the silence, deliberate, knowing. Daniel lurched back toward the bed, fumbling for the lamp on the nightstand. The bulb flickered to life with a dull yellow glow, spilling feeble light across the room. The hallway beyond their door was empty. The study door remained open, its darkness unmoving, but the chair. Lauren's heart clenched. It was turned. Not much, barely perceptible, but enough. Enough to face the doorway, as though something or someone had been sitting in it, watching, listening, and had only just now acknowledged them. She felt sick. Daniel exhaled sharply, scrubbing a hand down his face. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. I don't know. Maybe the floor's uneven. Maybe." Lauren didn't care. She was already reaching for her robe, swinging it around her shoulders with shaking hands. "I'm not staying here," she said. Daniel looked at her, his brow furrowed, still grasping for logic, for reason, but whatever argument he had died on his lips, because he felt it too. The way the air inside the house had changed. The way the walls seemed to listen. Then, from across the room, "Mom!" Both of them turned. Emily stood in the doorway of her bedroom, her small figure silhouetted in the dim light. Her blonde hair was tousled from sleep, her nightgown slightly oversized, hanging loose against her frame. But her face. Lauren's stomach twisted. Emily wasn't scared. She wasn't groggy, wasn't rubbing her eyes or asking why they were awake. She stood very still, her arms slack at her sides, her bare feet pale against the hardwood floor. And then, softly, she spoke again. "He says you shouldn't be afraid," she murmured. Lauren's blood turned to ice. Daniel stiffened. "What?" Emily's head tilted slightly. "He says it's okay," she continued, her voice eerily calm. "He just wants to talk." Lauren felt as if something were pressing on her chest, forcing the air from her lungs. "Emily," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you talking about?" Emily's lips parted slightly, as if she were listening. Then, slowly, carefully, she raised one small hand and pointed to the open study door. Lauren's vision swam. Daniel moved first, crossing the room in quick, urgent strides, scooping Emily into his arms. She didn't resist. She didn't react at all. He turned toward Lauren. "We're leaving." Lauren nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Daniel carried Emily down the stairs, not bothering with shoes, with coats, with anything other than getting them out. Lauren followed, her pulse thundering in her ears. She did not look at the study door as they passed. She did not dare. But as she reached the bottom step, the sensation hit her so suddenly that she gasped. Watched. She was being watched. Not from behind. Not from the study. From above. Her gaze lifted hesitant, trembling to the top of the stairs. And she saw it. A shadow. Tall. Broad. Unmoving. No features, no discernible form. Just darkness thicker than the surrounding night, cut into the shape of a man. Watching them leave. The front door slammed behind them as they stumbled into the cold night air, gasping, shaking. Lauren turned to Daniel, to Emily, to the house looming behind them. They had left it, but it had not left them. The Whitakers never returned to the house. They drove through the night, checking into a roadside motel miles away, too shaken to sleep. Daniel made arrangements the next morning, called a realtor, called movers, called anyone who could remove them from that place without them ever having to set foot inside it again. They never spoke of what happened, not in detail, not to friends, not to family. They didn't need to. Something had been in that house, something that had watched them, breathed near them, whispered to them. Emily never mentioned him again. She stopped humming the tune. She seemed unchanged, as if the house had never touched her. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, Lauren would catch her staring off into nothing, lips pressed together, a knowing look in her eyes. The house was sold within a month. The market in Santa Barbara hot enough that no one questioned why the Whitakers left so soon. A new family moved in, a retired couple, childless, excited for a peaceful life near the ocean. They lasted 3 weeks. Neighbors said they left in the middle of the night, just as the Whitakers had, refusing to take anything but their suitcases. The property sat empty for a while after that, the windows dark, the yard growing wild. A for sale sign went up again, then another, then another. No one stayed. And though the house remained, standing tall against the cliffs, untouched by time, it was never truly empty. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.